It's Friday, the 21st of April, 2023.
The last word in podcasting news. This is the Podnews Weekly Review with James Cridland and Sam Sethi.
I'm James Cridland, the editor of Podnews in Berlin.
And I'm Sam Sethi, the CEO of Podland, still stuck just outside of London.
Never mind. In the chapters today, Spotify exclusives go away, or do they? RØDE launches 7 new products at the NAB show. The Podcast Academy Award finally announced. Fake Joe Rogan, near Zickerman, a new proposal for cross-app comments, and much, much more. Plus...
Hi, this is Stephen B., the CEO and founder of CurioCaster. I'll be on later to talk about CurioCaster, Sovereign Feeds, Music Side Project, and the Split Kit.
And I'm Elisa Shearer from the Pew Research Center, and later I'll talk about our new podcast research.
They will. This podcast is sponsored and hosted by Buzzsprout. Last week, more than 4,000 people started a podcast with Buzzsprout. Podcast hosting made easy with powerful tools and remarkable customer support. And now you can turn your listeners into supporters with Buzzsprout subscriptions. You can try it on us if you like. weekly.podnews.net.
From your daily newsletter, the Podnews Weekly Review.
James, let's kick this off. Well, it's a little bit of a congratulations, first of all. After nearly 4 years, Buzzsprout's own podcast called Buzzcast has reached their 100th episode. So a round of applause to all concerned.
Hurrah. Hurrah for them. Yes, that's a splendid thing if you can hit 100 episodes. So many congratulations to Buzzcast.
Now, James, you said you're in Berlin. What are you doing in Berlin?
I am here for a conference that Spotify is running for the German language parts of the world. And yes, so looking forward to that. As we record, that's going to be tomorrow. But because of the slight vagaries of recording this show, it will already have happened by the time this show goes out. So, yeah, so I can't tell you anything about it because I haven't been there yet.
Yes, time travel. Go on, James, do it now. Okay, well, let's cover off some of the other Spotify announcements that have happened. Gimlet, first off, Spotify is stopping the platform exclusivity for some of its Gimlet shows. Tell me more.
Yes, so this is a story in Semaphore, which, essentially it says that Spotify is stopping platform exclusivity for some of its Gimlet shows. It turns out that it's probably one of its Gimlet shows, which is Science Versus. I'm not sure that this is a major change, but we have seen Spotify removing exclusives from some shows in the past. And my kind of feeling around all of it is that Spotify is now less about exclusives and more about ad sales and reaching as many people as they possibly can. And that appears to be happening in this case. But they say that Gimlet staff have been told that Spotify will allow some more of the company's shows on other audio platforms as well. So perhaps that's good news for fans of open podcasting.
Spotify acquired Gimlet for $230 million back in 2019. And it had high hopes that exclusive access to podcasts like Reply All would bring new subscribers to the streaming service. Do you think Gimlet's been a successful acquisition, James?
Oh, yeah. Certainly has. They've, there's a great amount of knowledge in the Gimlet organization, but also there's a great amount of fantastic content that has come out of that. So, I know that things have changed, and that certainly Reply All, which was the big show 4 or 5 years ago, has, of course, I think it's temporarily stopped production, so they say, but, that's obviously gone away. But there's been plenty of other very successful shows from Gimlet, and I think that that's been a good thing for them.
Jake Warren, friend of the show from Message Urge, tweeted out, sadly, the Gimlet magic is gone, and the party is well and truly over. So I don't think everyone thinks it's good news.
Yeah, well, you can certainly see if you were a fan of, as I was, the Reply All show, and then all of a sudden that rather imploded. You can certainly see that that's not a great thing. But that's change, unfortunately, and that's what happens in terms of change.
Moving on then, The Ringer. This is another acquisition, I assume, James, that Spotify bought, and it was generally held that the shows were exclusive to the platform. It's not quite true now, James. It seems that more of the Ringer shows are now becoming non-exclusive as well.
Well, there's only been one. So the Ringer is really interesting because apparently Bill Simmons basically told Daniel Ek, don't make any of my shows exclusives because we need the ad revenue. And if you make them exclusives, then we won't get the ad revenue anymore. And so the Ringer shows are all apparently non-exclusive, apart from one of them, the Ringer MMA show. Were very keen to point out to me that, no, they are exclusive on Spotify. The show was once produced on Spotify Green Room. There are a few shows which you can find on Apple Podcasts, but, not for some time. That show is now being made using Twitter Spaces. So it goes to say, what's going on there. But I think, apart from that, pretty well every Ringer show is available to anyone on whatever platform that they want to end up using.
Okay, let's move on then. A little bit more Spotify news. Starting from June the 1st, Chartable will no longer provide confirmed plays and episode consumption data from Apple Podcasts. Are they closing the wall again around Chartable?
No, I don't think they are. I think actually, weirdly, this is Apple's wall. There's never been a method of programmatically getting podcast consumption data to other services. So things like, how far did people get through this particular show, and and all that kind of stuff that you can see in Apple Podcasts Connect, but you can't export that information in a programmatic way without you yourself logging into Apple Podcasts. And I think that's essentially what Chartable is stopping doing. Chartable, I think, was running a scraper which you typed in your Apple Podcast username and password, and then, Chartable would go in and grab that information. And they finally said, you know what, we're not going to be doing that anymore. And so starting on June the 1st, they're stopping doing all of that weird scraping that they were doing. I mean, you'll still be able to get downloads from Apple Podcasts and from other platforms as well, just as you can on any podcast host or any podcast analytics service. But this particular thing is, I think, probably a sensible move by Chartable to stop scraping the information from Apple Podcasts Connect.
Now, Spotify falls at the first hurdle. Hey, get that one in early.
Yeah.
Spotify has announced it's closing Hurdle, a popular music guessing game purchased last year for an undisclosed amount. On its website, it said, thanks for playing Hurdle, but unfortunately we have to say goodbye. A pop-up message reads on the Hurdle website, from May the 5th, Hurdle will no longer be available. Why have they closed it, James? I mean, it seems like Wordle was such a big success for New York Times. Was Hurdle just a failure then?
Well, some of the stories that I've read suggest that Hurdle wasn't a particularly big thing. I mean, I think it was a big thing in the community that I follow, and certainly watching, the good folk from radio have been playing this game every day. It's a bit like Beat the Intro, I suppose. But from that point of view, that was fun. I mean, it was a bit strange because it can't be that complicated to run Hurdle, which is just a music discovery tool. And surely that's what Spotify is all about. It's about music discovery tools. So I don't really understand why they've closed it, but clearly, Spotify are closing a bunch of things at the moment, and that's one of the things that Spotify has ended up closing. So RIP Hurdle. I never played you once, but I'm sure you were very good.
There you go. Now, this is an interesting one. Spotify strikes a creator video deal with Jellysmack. Do you know who Jellysmack is, James?
I don't know who Jellysmack is. You've had a bit more of a look into this, haven't you?
Yeah, so Spotify is building out its catalogue of videos by repackaging existing content from top creators into its video podcasts. So Jellysmack is the company behind Mr. Beast and Bailey Sarin, with the second one I don't really know, but Mr. Beast is massive.
Yeah.
Why are they doing this? Are they trying to compete with YouTube?
Well, it looks as if they are producing stuff which is edited footage from the long-form content which already exists on YouTube, and basically using that in other formats on Spotify's platform. So it does look as if Spotify is getting a little bit more into video, which is, always interesting to end up seeing. They've made some video podcast deals in the past, and perhaps this is just a nice way of getting some bigger names in without those names actually having to do an awful lot.
Seems an odd thing to do, but anyway, I'm sure it will progress. Talking of more video, video podcasts are coming to APM. Financially inclined, starting on Thursday. It'll break down money lessons for a teen and a young adult audience. The episodes will be available on both YouTube and in an audio form via RSS. Who's APM, James?
So APM is American Public Media, which comes out of Minnesota, out of St. Paul. And this new show that they have is with a YouTube influencer type person who I think is pronounced Yanely Espinal. It's very much a young person's podcast all about keeping money simple. That's the basic plan there. And so what they're doing is they're producing that as a video podcast onto YouTube, and then you'll also be able to listen to the audio only on RSS, because apparently, podcasts can't be video at all. I'm not quite sure where they've got this idea from, because they surely should be producing at least a video feed, or even better, an alternate enclosure, so that those podcast apps which are capable of it can actually show the video version. But maybe there's a good reason why they're not doing that quite yet.
To be fair, I mean, look, the alternative enclosure is the right way for the open community to go, and apps need to enable that. I know Podverse does already. I am not sure on Fountain. I know Podland already does, but it's not released. And I'm not sure on Curocaster. But again, as a community of apps, we need to support the enclosure tag to give the hosts the reason to support and embed using the enclosure tag. Yeah. I think if we don't, we will cede control to Apple, Spotify, and YouTube very quickly. That's my worry.
Yeah, I think certainly ceding control to Spotify and YouTube. I think Apple, they don't support the alternate enclosure tag. Perhaps they will in the future. But they, of course, support video podcasts, and they have done ever since video podcasts were a new and exciting thing. But certainly, Spotify has this weird proprietary thing that you have to have with Spotify. YouTube, of course, isn't podcasting at all, really. I think you're absolutely right. If we're not careful, we will cede control over the video portion to both Spotify and to YouTube. And perhaps that needs to be a little bit more open as well. Now,
Cory Doctorow, he's an author and activist. If you haven't heard of him, he's a very smart guy, has criticised Spotify, the BBC as well, and Apple for operating walled gardens instead of an open podcasting platform, which we've been shouting about for ages.
Yes, he was talking on a podcast called The Changelog, and he was criticising the BBC, but I don't really follow the criticism of the BBC. I'm all for criticism of the BBC. I'll jump in. Hold me back. But I'm not necessarily sure that I understood his criticism, which was basically that BBC Sounds, which is the BBC's music podcasts and radio app, is there to stop people from skipping through the ads. He's a bright chap, is Cory. He's worked for the BBC in the past, so he surely understands that the main point of the BBC Sounds app is for the UK audience, which doesn't carry any ads at all. And secondly, actually, you can skip the podcast ads quite happily within BBC Sound. So I don't really understand what he's talking about there, but I think he's got a good point in terms of the Apple thing. He calls Apple's premium subscription service, quote, a deliberate piece of engineering that allows Apple to usurp the relationship between audiences and podcasters. And I think he's got a point there in terms of if you're using Patreon or if you're using buymeacoffee.com or any of these services, then you can go and grab the details of your supporters and you can email them and you can do all kinds of other things with them. Whereas with Apple, it's actually quite difficult to even work out how many people you have who are paying for your individual, ad-free show.
Yeah, I've long called Apple Podcasts the IE7 of podcasting, and it still remains so today. Now, moving on. We'll leave them there.
No.
Oh, I would say, though, at your conference with Spotify tomorrow, your time travel, you certainly got some questions to ask them anyway. So,
Yes, well, certainly some questions to ask. I mean, the weird thing is that Spotify wants to interview me. So there's Javier Pignol, who is head of international talk shows. So basically very, very important at Spotify. But he's going to be interviewing me.
Oh.
Yeah, so that'll be, that's lovely. But also very, very sort of weird and humbling. So that should be fun. Looking forward to that. And also looking forward to interviewing for the Podcast Business Journal, Nina Harvey, who looks after much of Spotify's audio advertising within Europe. And she'll be talking to me about how much Spotify have been investing into the podcast space in Europe. So quite interesting to find out more information about that. So you can spot that in the Podcast Business Journal. You won't find that online, not quite yet, but you will find it if you go and subscribe at podcastbusinessjournal.com.
Now, James, you've just flown in from the NAB show. What's the NAB show?
I have, yes. Can you tell that I sound as if I've not necessarily had enough sleep? The NAB show is, that's an interesting question. I believe it's the National Association of Broadcasters. And it was their 100th show just gone at Las Vegas. Lots and lots of people were there. Lots of podcast companies were there, which was nice. Blueberry was there. Todd Cochran was looking almost as tired as I am.
Don't eat me, Todd Cochran.
Also, Podbean were there, giving away some very fancy backpacks, I noticed. I did kind of hung around for a little bit, but then I got slightly embarrassed. Libsyn were in a different place, and Riverside was there, and they had their own barista. So if you found them, then you were doing very well. It was really good. It's a massive, massive, great big show. I forget the numbers that they said were there. So I was there interviewing Valerie Geller, who is a radio and podcast consultant. And she ended up being, a really, really interesting interview. So that was good. There was a bunch of other stuff there as well. I should tell you that the attendance was 65,013. The total amount of people who were there, 65,013. I can tell you also that I was three of those because I appeared in their database 3 times. Massive, great big thing. 17,000 international attendees, of which I was clearly one of them. 1,200 exhibiting companies. It's a big, big, big thing. So it was a good couple of days, although tiring, and I was only there for 36 hours. Frankly, 35 hours, probably too much for Vegas. But there were an awful lot of other speakers there as well. There were people talking about the future of TV, and they're doing work on transitioning to a new version of the ATSC platform that they use in the United States. There's lots of wittering about AM in cars and competition for the dashboard and all of that. And the NAB are even concerned about artificial intelligence. We'll probably come back to artificial intelligence in just a little bit. So lots of interesting stuff going on at the NAB.
So Uri Geller's wife, what did she say about the future of podcasting then?
Not Uri Geller's wife.
Okay.
There are lots of Gellers. She was good. She was on form. She has written a very good book, which is called Beyond Powerful Radio, and you can find beyondpowerfulpodcasting.com is, I believe, a website address as well. And Valerie has worked with lots of people very, very closely for a number of years. I mean, some of the things that she talks about are making sure that you use your language correctly and making sure that you write for the ear rather than writing for the eye, which is an important thing if you're a print journalist getting into podcasting, and also making sure that you're using the word you a lot. So it's no good saying, I feel this and I feel that. It's much better for a podcast to turn around and say, how do you feel about this? What do you think? And this is, of course, where cross-app comments assistants and all of that kind of stuff should come in really, really handy. But no, she's a class act, so it was a good thing to interview her after so many years.
Yeah. Now, CEO Curtis Leggett, who's the president of the National Association of Broadcasters, or the NAB, as you said, this fierce competition for the dashboard is quite entertaining for us as podcasters, because if General Motors does remove CarPlay and Android, which they're suggesting, I wonder what they'll put in its place to allow podcasters to be able to play podcasts on their cars.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a bit of a mistake from General Motors, it has to be said. But there again, it hasn't done Tesla any harm, not having CarPlay or indeed Android Auto in their cars. But yeah, I mean, it's a different world in America. I think that's the main thing. It's different in terms of radio consumption, where over 50% of radio consumption is in the car. It's only about 20% or so in the rest of the world. So radio and the car are very much intertwined. And I think that's what's worrying the broadcasters in the US, is that quite a lot of vehicle manufacturers now are talking about taking AM out of the car entirely for, they claim, technical reasons. But you could also see that perhaps AM radio in the United States isn't what it once was. And clearly this is going to, move this conversation on a little bit further. So I think, the NEB is having a little bit of an existential crisis at the moment around seeing the number one place where you listen to the radio, if you're in the US, kind of turning its back on it.
Now, we talked about artificial intelligence. I mean, again, Curtis Leggett said there is potential dangers of artificial intelligence. Also, somebody called Duncan Crabtree, the National Executive Director of Performers and Broadcasters Union in Ireland, said AI voice cloning for podcasts is a concern. So on that, you had a story, James, about a company called Enco, a radio automation company that has launched 2 new AI-powered services, AI Track, which automates a radio announcer, and Enco, again, GPT, can't people come up with a better name, makes radio ads automatically. I mean, we talked about a company last week as well. Yeah. So look, do Duncan Crabtree and Curtis Leggett have a point? Is AI a concern for the radio and podcasting world?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI in certain cases is a bit of a concern, and so Duncan Crabtree Ireland is his full name actually, and the union.
So he's not
from Ireland. I know, it's a weird name, isn't it? Duncan Crabtree Ireland, but the union is SAG-AFTRA, which is the union which looks after performers and broadcasters. And I can well see his point in that actually, and we've already heard stories about radio presenters whose voices have been cloned by, the company that they're doing shows for, and then they can get those radio presenters to say all kinds of things because they've got a clone of their voice. So I can well see that. I think it's absolutely right that the union gets involved in that sort of thing to look after their members. So I think that makes a bunch of sense. In terms of the new stuff that's coming out of Enco, I mean, basically, as soon as you put artificial intelligence on anything, then you get acres of press coverage. And that's exactly what Enco has been doing. They're a radio automation company, much like RCS or similar companies who basically, produce all of these services that play the songs and play the adverts and everything else. And AI Track is basically a way that you can have a radio personality on your station when there's nobody there to talk about the music that you play or to give travel news or weather information or all that kind of stuff with an AI voice. So again, you can see why performers unions may not be over the moon at that. And Enco GPT making radio ads automatically. Yes, we played a little clip from a radio ad that another service, Adthos, had built us last week. So much interest in that, because actually one of the things that stops people from advertising on the radio and stops people from advertising in podcasts is, I don't know how to make an ad, and I don't know who to go and voice it and everything else. If you can get rid of that entire hurdle, then that makes life really, really easy. So you've got all of that stuff. And then, of course, you've got Joe Rogan that has realized that there are other people now who have released some more AI-generated stuff with him. And I mean, it's very obvious when you have a look at what the people have been doing. They say this is AI, this is not the real Joe Rogan. Everywhere, you would be under no illusion that it wasn't the real Joe Rogan. But Joe Rogan's still a little bit, unhappy in terms of what that might end up meaning for him in the future as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was a conversation between Joe Rogan and Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, as you said, with a load of disclaimers, and the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast are not reflective of their actual thoughts. But this is about as bad as I think you said it last week, this is about as bad as AI gets, and it will only get better. And so each iteration of the Joe Rogan AI voice will get closer and closer to the real Joe Rogan, till I guess there's the Turing test. Can you tell the difference between Joe Rogan and AI Joe Rogan?
Yeah. No, and, some of the voice clones I've heard have been really good. I mean, really, really good. So, in fact, I did hear a conversation at Radio Days, not this year, but last year, from somebody, a very well-respected person within the radio industry, and he was saying that he was talking to someone, and I think it was the estate of Alan Freeman, who was, I guess, the closest that the UK has ever had to Casey Kasem, the big voiced DJ who does all of the countdowns and everything else, and they were talking about cloning his voice. And basically looking after what he would have done if he was still alive today doing shows. So, the whole thing is, it's all a bit weird, isn't it?
Yeah, well, Bruce Willis has already sold the voice IP rights to his voice for various other films that he may not act in, but his voice will be used. And I know that several voices have been used in other films in comebacks. So Carrie Fisher's voice was used in the Star Wars film in that same way. I wonder, I guess the only people who are going to make money out of this again will be lawyers who will have voice IP copyright protection that they will be looking for.
Yes, I guess so. I mean, it's going to be really interesting to watch what happens there. And, I think, in terms of who owns the copyright in your voice, well, that's very similar to who owns the copyright in your likeness, in your photograph. And there are already some quite established rules around that. So, it's a very different world. It really is.
So the European Parliament is developing stricter regulations around AI, including requiring chatbot developers to disclose when they use copyrighted content. So it is happening.
Yeah, and I think that is sensible. I have noticed a big uptake in the amount of articles which are being written on Medium, which of course pays you a certain amount of money depending on how many people read your articles. And I've seen a significant uptick of really boring podcast advice. And I'm there reading them going, this podcast advice is done with no flair, with no interest, with no excitement. I suspect that they are all AI written. And it's getting very hard for me to know which is AI and which is real in terms of some of these articles, to the point where I'm thinking that actually probably get rid of Medium, because it looks as if it's just being spammed by lots of people who are just making as many articles as they possibly can using Chat GPT or similar AI models such as that.
Now, let's travel back to the NAB very quickly.
Oh, let's.
And get off the AI helter-skelter. Now, RØDE announced 7 new products at the NAB show. What were they, James? Not all of them, but just the main ones.
Yes.
I mean, just stick to the knitting, get the main ones.
Yes, well, it was 7 products and updates. And so they didn't announce 7 products, but they did announce 7 products and updates. But the big products that they announced was the Rodecaster Duo, which is basically like the Rodecaster Pro, but it's got less faders on it. It's got less inputs on it. It's a shrunk down version, and that will work absolutely fine if it's just you and a mate in your house. It's got 2 mic inputs. It's absolutely fine. So the Rodecaster Duo looks very smart and very neat. There's the PodMic USB, which is for the first time they've put a USB connection into that microphone. It's an XLR mic as well, so that's a very smart thing. And then there's this new thing that they have launched, which is pretty well an industry first. It's a thing which has got an XLR audio interface in it, as well as a video capture card. In one. It's called the Streamer X. It's part of the Rode X list of, stuff for streamers. I'm there looking at it and thinking that's a really good box for someone who is, on OnlyFans or something like that. It's a really good box for that. Or if you're streaming a game or whatever, but particularly for OnlyFans, it's going to be a great little box. So all power to RØDE for working out a new market, I think. But yeah, really, really impressive. There was a real buzz. They were advertising it on the B&H stand, which of course is one of the. Is it the B&H, that large American company that sells audio equipment? I want to call it B&H, and I really hope it's not. Yes, it is. It's B&H, because I'm there going, Benson and Hedges. That was B&H as well.
Yes, it was.
It's not. Yeah. English cigarette brands, ladies and gentlemen. Yes. It was really exciting. I was trying to get a photograph of the new toys and everything else, and I basically just had to take a picture over somebody's shoulder as they were doing a video interview, because it was a video interview followed by a video interview followed by a video interview, and I just got bored. So I thought, right, I'm just going to take some pictures and then leave. But very, very impressive. So they've done a really good job there.
So I've got the Rodecaster Pro 2 here with me, and I'm looking at the picture that you took of the Duo. I think that's a perfect home podcasting unit. I really do. I like the setup. You don't need. I've got 6 channels with virtual channels, and it's such an overly engineered, complex box compared to the simpler Duo, which I think would be perfect. Why, though, would they not have put the video card into the Duo and just made it as well as one unit?
Well, I mean, maybe they are focusing on the Rodecaster being an audio device, and this new Streamer X device as being, it's a new product by itself. So maybe they're actually having a look at that. The one thing I would also mention about the Streamer X is that it has software in it which also your Rodecaster will also have, which will automatically connect to Røde's wireless microphones as well. So you can wear those clip-on microphones. And it will interface with those as well. So it really is the perfect tool for somebody who is at home, maybe doing training, or maybe doing, something else.
Well, I think I'll try it if they do the upload of the.
Yeah, try it on your OnlyFans channel.
Well, yeah, but you can't be the only subscriber, James. That's what's sad about it. No, what I was going to say was, before you put me off my lunch, was I could actually put a wireless go-to mic, and if they do the software update, because it's not available right now, I checked it last night, on my Rodecaster Pro 2, then I could try next week and see what the difference is, because at the moment I'm using, an XLR mic, and it would be interesting to see what the difference would be between the two.
Yeah. And I believe I would not expect necessarily that software update in the next week. I think it's going to be a few months from here.
Okay.
But I think, they're it was a very clever move of them to, announce everything all at the NAB show. And actually, what was particularly good is I got to meet Nick from Rhode's PR department. He lives in Sydney. I live in Brisbane. So it was very good to actually be able to say hello and to have a chat with him.
So when are we announcing the official sponsorship? Come on.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, if you want to see more, Elsie Escobar, friend of the show, also is covering her initial thoughts on it on She Podcasts, episode 397, if you want to hunt that out.
Excellent.
They also announced, James, something called Rode Unify. It's in a public beta. Unify is Rode's totally free virtual mixing and streaming software. So if you haven't got a Rodecaster Pro 2 or a Duo, you can do it in software. The beta introduced the ability to assign voice effects such as reverb, echo, and pitch, mixer actions such as sensor buttons and back channel fade outs to your microphones. So yeah, it's free to download. You can get it today, and it's available in beta.
Yeah, it's a smart thing. And I think this is one of the trends happening in the podcast technology space is that actually you're seeing hardware companies become software companies become hardware companies, and there's that sort of mix in between now. So certainly seeing, for example, Shure having very nice software for their microphones so that you can configure them and everything else. I think that there's going to be a bunch of that going on, and I think very interesting seeing that trend continuing.
Yes. Now, James, quick question: where do you get your news from?
Where do I get my news from? It's mostly from two places. It's from the ABC in Australia and from The Guardian, which I think probably lays me out as being a lefty, tofu-eating wokerati. But yes, that's basically where I get my news from. Where'd you get yours from?
Well, I don't watch much television anymore, and I actually now get it mainly from podcasts. I get it from The Rest is Politics and The News Agent. I occasionally skim TV news, and then I go to websites like News Now or TechMeme to get my summary news. So that's where I get mine. You get yours elsewhere. But the Pew Research Centre has released a study examining podcasts as a source of news and information. The study suggests that 2/3 of all podcast listeners have heard news discussed on the podcasts they listen to, and almost all of them expect the news to be accurate. However, few directly listen to podcasts from news organisations themselves, like the BBC, I suppose. Now, you had a chance to talk to the person behind that research. What was the scoop?
Yes, I did. I talked to one of the senior researchers at the Pew Research Centre who put this together. She's called Elisa Shearer, and I asked her what they found out, but I also started by just asking who the Pew Research Centre was.
The Pew Research Center is a nonprofit research center that studies American views and opinions about our changing world. We're nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy, and we're based in Washington, D.C. in the United States.
So you have recently released podcasts as a source of news and information, which is a bunch of information, not just about news podcasts, but about podcasts in general as well, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
What were the main things that you found in that research?
Yeah, we undertook this study because we know that there's a lot of great industry data about podcasts out there. We've been tracking some of that industry data through our State of the News Media report. That's something that we release every couple of years. With this project, we really wanted to go into how Americans actually use podcasts and their experiences there. So not just the kind of underlying audience data, but Americans' opinions about the podcasts that they're going to. We found that podcasts are a big part of a lot of people's information diets in the U.S. 49% of our respondents said that they had listened to a podcast in the last year. And actually 20% of U.S. adults said that they have listened to a podcast at least a few times a week or more.
So that's particularly high, and quite a lot of news in podcasts, but not necessarily news podcasts, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly right. 2/3 of podcast listeners. So we took those 49% of Americans and asked them sort of follow-up questions about their podcast listening. 2/3 of those folks said that they hear about the news in some way on the podcast that they listen to, that we let them define that for themselves. We don't give them a hard definition. But we asked specifically then about, well, are the podcasts you listening to, are any of them connected directly to a news organization? And just 20% of listeners said that, yes, one of the podcasts I listen to is connected to a news organization. So there's a lot of news gathering that people are getting in a fragmented information environment that might not necessarily be coming directly from news outlets.
Yeah, it might not be coming from news outlets. I guess might not be coming from journalists either, I suppose. Is there anything? Totally, is there anything there in terms of the trust of the stuff that they hear, or is that a bit far away from the research that you were doing?
I can't connect the source of the news that they're getting to the trust, but one of the notable findings from the report is that 87% of listeners, which is very high when you're talking about trusted information in the States, 87% of podcast listeners said that they largely trust and expect to be accurate the news and information that they hear on podcasts.
Yeah, and it's certainly something that we see in other research, that podcasts are very trustworthy and all of that. You also asked what people are listening to podcasts for as well.
This is one of my favorite questions. Yeah, there's a variety of reasons that Americans are turning to podcasts. Entertainment was the top one. 60% of listeners said that was a major reason, but also learning. 55% that said that was a major reason. And this is my favorite response: just to have something to listen to while doing something else. That was in the third highest major reason that people listed for listening to podcasts.
Yeah, it's there's a radio station here in Australia which talks about music for your ears when your eyes are busy. And I think it's just a wonderful phrase. The research that you did talked about the change of lifestyle and what people have been doing since listening to a podcast. It appears that we can, us podcasters can alter people's lives in many different ways.
Yeah, one of the most common things that listeners said they did after listening to a podcast was just consuming some kind of media, like watching a movie, reading a book, or listening to music. One interesting response that we had from that set of responses was 36% of podcast listeners said they made or tried a lifestyle change. Again, they could define that however they want. We gave some examples like trying out a workout or a new diet or journaling, but that's about a third of podcast listeners said that something that they would qualify as a lifestyle change is something that they did in response to a podcast they listened to.
Yeah, and is that advertising focused, or is that just people talking about stuff that they found interesting? I'm wondering whether it's an advertising thing or not.
It could be either. We let people kind of think about that for themselves in the same way, especially in thinking about surveys and recall. You might not necessarily remember whether you heard it on an ad or you heard it because of the hosts were talking about it, especially since hosts read ads a lot of the time. Another finding from that battery, though, is that 28% of listeners said they had actually bought something, either promoted or talked about on a podcast. So again, we didn't kind of tease out that figuring out if it was actively promoted, but 28% of listeners said that they've bought something because it was promoted or talked about on a podcast.
No, I suppose one of the things that us foreigners know about the US is that it's a divided place. You're either red or you're blue. I'm wondering whether you did any research there in terms of what how Republicans viewed the podcasts that they listened to versus Democrats. Was there any difference there in terms of that?
Yeah, one of the interesting high-level findings from the report are that Republicans and Democrats, while, as you said, have occasion in other areas of the media, very different media diets and opinions, actually turn to podcasts at about the same rate. And hear news on the podcast they listen to at about the same rate. So no huge differences there. About half of each party roughly have listened to a podcast in the past 12 months. Once there, they do tend to have some different experiences. Republicans are more likely to see the podcast that they listen to as a source of unique news. So Republicans are more likely to say that they've heard news on a podcast extremely or fairly often that they wouldn't have heard elsewhere. For example, Republicans are about twice as likely as Democratic podcast listeners to say that. Republicans are also a lot more likely to say that they trust the news they get from podcasts more than the news they get from other sources. That specifically might speak more to Republicans in the states, their views of media sources in general, especially since that question asked about the media in general, and because trust in general, and we just asked, do you think that this information is accurate? There isn't a big party difference, but Republicans podcast listeners seem to kind of see this news that they're getting as something that they can trust more than the news they're getting elsewhere, and it's something that they might not hear elsewhere.
Yeah. No, that is really interesting, and and obviously there's the whole different media landscape anyway from from both sides as well. We've also on this very podcast we've been talking about kids and kids' consumption of podcasting. I know that you didn't look specifically into kids, but certainly looking into age groups. Did you find any differences in terms of the amount of podcast listening that's happening in different age groups in the US?
Sure. So we survey all adults over 18, which definitely isn't kids anymore, depending on your definition, but does include some Gen Z now. They're getting up there. Younger adults, like in a lot of digital media consumption that we study, younger adults are a lot more likely to be listening to podcasts. The rates are really high when you get to the youngest age group. 2/3 of adults ages 18 to 29 say that they've listened to a podcast in the past year, versus when you get 65 plus, it's just 28%. Younger adults tend to listen more frequently. Interestingly, they're not. Once you look at the listeners of podcasts, younger adults aren't more likely to hear news on the podcast they're listening to than older adults. That might be because when we look at listeners, the older listeners are actually doing it for different reasons. So younger podcast listeners are turning there for entertainment. They're turning there for diversion, that having something to listen to while you're doing something else. Whereas the most common response among the older listeners that we surveyed was learning. That's why they're turning to the podcast they're listening to. So there's not only difference in frequency, but once you get to the podcast, the different age groups are turning there for different reasons.
Yeah, so there's a different need state as well, which is fascinating. And I think some of the more international research that we've been covering recently again shows that different countries have that as well, which is an interesting side. Was there anything that particularly surprised you about the data that you found?
Surprised me. Great question. We asked about 12 different topics when it comes to podcasting. And I was surprised at how honestly evenly spread out the consumption of those topics were. Obviously, there's some that rise to the top and some that rise to the bottom. But I think 9 of them are all above 30%. None reach over half of listeners saying they're regularly turning to it. Nothing is really dominating the podcasting space in this questionnaire, which I think speaks to how kind of diverse and maybe even fragmented the media sector is.
And I guess I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I didn't ask how you worked out all of this information. There are obviously lots of different ways of doing studies and surveys online and on telephones and everything else. How many people had you talked to, and how did you actually get in touch with them?
Sure, that's a great question. I love answering this question. The Pew Research Center, we have what's called the American Trends Panel, which is a probability, which means randomly selected. Everyone in the United States has an equal chance of being randomly selected survey panel. This survey surveyed about 5,000 respondents, which equates to between 2,000 and 3,000 podcast listeners. And we try to send people short surveys that they feel comfortable answering. And we do that once or twice a month.
Cool. And where can people see this research in full if they want to?
Yeah, people can find this research and a lot of the research that we've been doing on podcasts and audio media and other kinds of media at pewresearch.org, PEW. And this, I also want to mention that this is the first report in a series of publications that will be focusing on a broad study of podcasts that we're doing throughout the year.
Oh, interesting. What other things are coming up? Are you able to tell us?
I can't be too specific, but we have a more data sciencey component and a few follow-up studies based on this research.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, James. Appreciate it.
There you go. Elisa Shearer, no relationship to Alan Shearer. And yes, from the Pew Research Centre. Now, moving on, James. baby boomers are not growing for some reason. It says here in a new study, another one, hit play boomer, Edison Research and NPR have revealed that the podcast listening among those aged 55 plus, that's me, not quite you yet. I think you're younger than that. So-called boomers has not grown in recent years. Why are my compatriots not listening to more podcasts, James?
Well, yes, why indeed? So Larry Rosin, who is also a boomer, he ended up presenting this particular data, and he suggests that one of the things is that actually, yes, they might think that they know what a podcast is, but actually they need a little bit more hand-holding in order to actually subscribe to one and listen to one and all of that. But there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in the 55 plus age group. So, some real fantastic opportunity in there. I guess it's the same problem that, oldies radio stations have, and that other media organizations have who aim at that particular marketplace, is that it's quite difficult to sell advertising in there, because all of the people who are buying your advertising are bright and bushy-tailed 25-year-olds, and they don't necessarily understand all of these old people's stuff. So there may be that, side of it as well. But it's a great piece of research. And I think there's some real opportunity there to focus on making podcasting easier and more interesting. And there are different reasons why older people are wanting to listen to podcasts. Seemingly quite a lot of it is education for the 55 plus age group. So, again, perhaps there are different formats that we could be having a look at here.
Well, maybe there are. Now, Neil Cowling from Fresh Air might have the answer. He says they've released all 3 new episodes of their Neuroscience of Blogs and Podcasts in partnership with Kinder Studios. Experts Robin Lauder and Catherine Templer-Lewis have been exploring the research into how our brains react and respond to long-form audio. Basically, why are podcasts so special? The results are pretty fascinating. Absorbing stories and information, it says, through audio releases different chemicals at different rates using different levels of attention, and ties into our daily conscious and unconscious rituals in a completely different way to video and short form content. So maybe there is a link between how long's a podcast and what our neuroscience brain does, James.
Yeah, maybe there is. I know that commercial radio in the UK have done very similar research in terms of what the brain says. So great to see that from the Fresh Air folk. And also a very clever move from TalkSport, which they have just announced. They've announced basically a podcast network of football podcasts, or if you're American, soccer podcasts. And it's basically there as a way to get advertisers, complete scale of fan-focused podcasts, of, being able to just make one buy and get into all of these football fans' shows. So it's quite a clever move. I think podcast radio has been doing something like that for a while. I know that Crowd Network and VoiceWorks Sports in the UK have been doing something a little bit similar. I think it's absolutely the right place if you're a sports radio station, as TalkSport is. It's absolutely the right thing to end up doing, to put some kind of a network together. And it reminds me of Hubbard, who have put, they're a broadcaster in the US, and they've put a bunch of shows together from, I think it was Minnesota, into one specific podcast app, and perhaps representing some of those for ad sales as well. All of that, I think, makes a bunch of sense to actually make it easier for advertisers to go out and buy those at scale.
I do think if you're like TalkSport, a football-focused radio station, that maybe there's not something live being broadcast you want to listen to, so you then go to the website, jump onto another podcast, and they're still making advertising revenue from it. Smart. Yeah. I mean, this is where the, Spotify broadcaster podcast stuff might come in as well. I think one of the things that when I was doing River Radio, we used Whooshka, which is now Spotify broadcaster podcast. Yeah. And we had our live shows going direct to podcast, but we did have a similar idea of getting other local podcasters to submit podcasts to our platform so that we could create a network. And again, it would have allowed us to put advertising around local content from other podcasters. So I can see why TalkSport are doing it. And again, the good news is, James, we might have Rob Lowenthal on the show next week. He's going through the Spotify PR police right now to get clearance. But if we can get clearance, he said he'll come on.
Yeah, well, that's a great thing. I know also that Triton have been very keen that we talk to Sharon Taylor from Omni Studio, because, of course, Sharon and Omni Studio have been doing podcast to broadcast for many years on their platform as well, with quite significant success. So and they're very keen to point out that Spotify haven't invented this stuff, which is always important. So yes,
we will reach out to them as well.
Exactly. And it's surprising that Acast haven't done that, but Acast have done a ton of other things. They ended up doing something for a couple of mental health charities in the UK and Ireland last week, selling a one-time payment to basically get an exclusive podcast mixtape. But the money of that went to some mental health charities, which is a really good way of both helping a couple of worthy charities, but also pointing out that you have a one-time payment platform which you can do this kind of stuff with. So a very clever plan from Acast as well there. And of course, Lizzie Pollett was in the Podcast Business Journal last week being interviewed, except it was your interview from a couple of weeks ago. So thank you for that, Sam.
Well, that's all right. Yeah, very welcome. Little known fact I found out yesterday from Ross Adams: women in Acast are known as A-sisters.
A-sisters, nice.
A-sisters. I don't know why. I was wondering whether the blokes were known as A-bros then, or whatever.
A-blokes.
I have no idea.
Amen.
A-blokes.
Amen.
Anyway, let's move on. Let's move on before we get in trouble. James, jobs. Finally, the Podcast Academy board has announced who's available on the board for the next year. Why they haven't put it on their own website yet, I don't know, because all I did was find out from LinkedIn, from every one of those board members posting, I became a board member. So that's how I found out.
Yes. Well, if you're a member, then you would have got a email, and the email went out. It was they send an email out every 3 weeks or so, every 3 or 4 weeks or so, and this was the first one after the board members had been voted in. They also needed to tell, I understand, the board members that didn't get voted in. They needed to end up telling those people that they hadn't been voted in. And so there was a little gap while they ended up doing that too. But we still don't actually know who the new treasurer is, for example. We know that Rob Greenlee is no longer a board member, so we don't know who the new treasurer is going to be and all of that. So, and I gather that we'll find that out over the next couple of weeks. So it's seemingly quite a slow process, but I'm sure that there are good reasons for it.
So we've got a couple of friends on there, James. Ariel Nissenblatt, Matty Stout, Jen Sargent.
Juleka Lantiga is also on there, and Jay Green and various other people. Yeah, there's a great big list of really good people who are on that particular list. So, really good to see some good, fresh names appearing there.
Well, you'll be glad to know one of my friends is on there, Amy Thacker, and she's going to be on the show next week to tell us all about what it's like to be on the Podcast Academy, the new board.
Excellent. Well, that will be good to look forward to. In other news, somebody else has left Spotify, and it's a biggie. It's the other co-founder of Anchor, Nir Zickerman, who until recently, he's currently VP and Global Head of Audiobooks. and he will be that until September the 30th, which is his last day. But he's announced now, gosh, how long is that is that leave notice that he has? But he's announced now that he will be working on, quote, a new project in the startup space. Now, I should point out that Michael Mignano, his other co-founder of Anchor, is working as a VC in the startup space. I wonder whether we're going to see a Mignano Zuckerman partnership again. Who knows? So he was, thrilled about moving on. That essentially means that all of the co-founders of Anchor have now gone, and indeed Anchor's brand has now gone as well.
I go back to the point I made many, many months ago. Why doesn't Spotify create a VC fund, get these really smart CEOs of founder startups, and give them the money to build whatever they're going to build next under the Spotify umbrella? Take an equity stake and let them get on, rather than waiting for their golden handcuffs. Clearly, the handcuffs come off on September the 30th, and he gets his payout, and then he's off. Why don't they just do that?
Yeah, indeed. And you could well say that for other companies as well. It must be a very difficult thing for someone who has started up a business, who has worked really, really hard, and then all of a sudden has to, get their expenses signed off by some, accountancy nerk in some other part of the business because you've just been bought. But then I suppose, there is always that. There is a new hire, though. Leroy Harris is Spotify's new UK and Ireland head of marketing, which is nice to see. Christine Lewis has joined NHPR as their new vice president of development. Luminary, though, is cutting people, cutting shows, and apparently has even reduced staff salaries, which is quite a thing. I noticed on American Airlines that the only podcasts that you can get on American Airlines seatbacks are from Luminary, which I thought was interesting. Paul Kim at Samsung appears to have left the company. He was the main contact for Samsung's free podcast service, and he's worked for the company for nearly 20 years. We also hear that other staff will be affected as well. Samsung haven't actually made any public announcements about layoffs, but they did see their lowest profit figure for a decade earlier on in the month. So clearly they'll be wanting to turn things around as well. But there are more jobs. If you're looking for a job, then Podnews has podcasting jobs around the industry and around the world, and they're free to post as well. And you'll find those at podnews.net/jobs.
I was looking for those jobs. Now, not that I need a job, by the way, before anyone asks, but there was a brilliant one in this you're going to have to say, being an Aussie now yourself, James.
In Woolloomooloo.
Woolloomooloo, what a place to work. I'd love to go there. It's a finger wharf, in case you're wondering. An old cargo dock that attracts a trendy clientele with fine dining, hip bars and water views on all sides.
Yes, it sounds really nice if you read that, doesn't it? Yes. It's right next to the city centre in Sydney, so it's a little walk away from there. It's got a silly name because there's lots of O's and L's and everything else. I have to tell you, it is
perfect for Scrabble.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, I mean, great for that sort of thing. I have to tell you, it is a very gentrified area in part of it, and not a very gentrified area in another part of it as well. And when you're walking through, you go, gosh, it's the sort of equivalent that you get when you're walking through parts of London that are really close to the city, but all of a sudden are not quite as up on their luck. So it's a strange part of the city centre there. So Woolloomooloo, in case you're wondering, means either a place of plenty or it means a young black kangaroo in the Gadigal language. So there you go. It's one of those two, perhaps.
Okay. Now, Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO, is also looking for a very interesting hire. He wants someone who's a videographer to follow him around for a brand new show. He says, I'm hiring maybe the most interesting job I've ever hired for. So he's got a new YouTube series. Oh, he would. And so, yeah, if you're looking to be the video man to follow Stephen Bartlett around, that's your job.
Yes. Good Lord. Oh, well, there you go.
And lastly, I had a chat with Jess Kaufman from She Podcast just today, actually. She's looking for some sponsors still. They've got their next event, She Podcast Live, in June at the MGM National Harbor in Washington, D.C., and they're trying desperately to find some new sponsors still. They're short of a couple. So if you are that person or that company and you would like to sponsor She Podcast Live, can you email jess@shepodcast.com? We are trying to help them put together a She Podcast London at the podcast show in May. Because both Ariel Nissenblatt and Lauren Purcell are going to be over, and there's a few other people like Naomi Meller who will be there as well. And so, yeah, keep an eye out. There may be a She Podcast Live in London coming up soon.
The tech stuff on the Pod News Weekly Review.
Yes, it's the stuff you'll find every Monday in the Podnews newsletter. Here's where we do all of the tech talk. Buzzsprout have launched dynamic mid-rolls. So you've been able to have dynamic pre-rolls and dynamic post-rolls for this show and for many others, which is a nice and fancy thing. Now you can get dynamic mid-rolls as well. It basically works out where it's going to put the mid-roll for you automatically, but you can basically program something in that appears, and maybe that's a sponsor credit or maybe that's something completely different. It's entirely up to you. You can find more details in the Buzzsprout website, which will have more details there. What else have we got? Pocket Casts have announced an episode search in the new beta version of the app. I haven't played around with it yet, but it is fascinating. Whenever I talk to people about Pocket Casts, they all go, oh, it's a brilliant app, isn't it? It's really, really good. It's the only app that I use. And the amount of people who end up saying that, it must have quite some usage.
Yeah, it looks like they want to try and unveil or unpack how you can find, say, a certain speaker in one podcast and in another podcast episode, rather than just searching for title. I think it's a really good idea. And yeah, so again, we've got Ellie Rubenstein from Pocket Cast on next week, James, to tell us all about it.
Excellent. I'm very much looking forward to that. It's a great app, and looking forward to finding out what else they're working on. Cross-app comments are coming soon. Well, we've been saying that for the last 2 years, haven't we? I think the first idea for a spec was ludicrously complicated. The second idea for a spec was paring it all down and basically going, if it uses the Mastodon API, then great. Even that, it turns out, is a bit too complicated. So what Daniel J. Lewis is currently doing is he is writing something which is super simple, super easy to end up using. It uses a JSON file, which is a good thing. It can use the same JSON file as the chapters file if you want it to, but you don't necessarily have to do that. But anyway, very cool to see Daniel working very hard on that. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that over the next couple of weeks.
Now, Moritz over at Contracts has announced that you can now add custom value splits, basically donation settings for individual episodes. So if you use Contracts, then great, you can start sharing your episode earnings with episode guests. It just got very easy, says Moritz.
Yeah, and so I'm guessing that talks with the Podcaster wallet and is just another way into the Podcaster wallet, which would make a bunch of sense. You're supporting the Podroll tag, aren't you, with your Podfans thing?
Yeah. Well, Kevin came up with the first idea. You then basically put it into Podnews Daily and this podcast as well. So I thought, why don't we expose it and see how it works? And it worked super quick. So yes, we have. And if you go onto our Twitter account at @JoinPodFans, you'll see some images of it working there. So yes, we've got Buzzcast, we've got Dudes and Dads working, we've got Mere Mortals working, and yours. And that's because they've only hand-coded them. But once hosts start to support the Podroll UI in the host, then it should be really, really simple for every podcaster to create a Podroll.
Yeah, and if you missed this from last week, this is essentially a way for a podcaster to be able to recommend other shows and to be able to recommend other shows in their network, or perhaps there are other shows that they just want to recommend, or perhaps it's a little bit of both. And so the idea is that it's much the same as a blog roll was 15 years or so ago, and this is much the same, but it's just called a pod roll because it's there for podcasts. So I think it's a good plan, and again quite similar to Apple's rather closed channels system, I think it's a good thing to keep an eye on.
Well, we also took what you put in to the GitHub, James, because you put rel equals channel and rel equals episode. Well, you didn't put, you put rel equals recommend, and we extended that to rel equals episode. So now within Podfans, and it's live, you can actually now go to any episode of any show and add it to a playlist and then have that appear. You can then click on play to play that whole playlist, or you can share that, or you can save it to your own playlist. So yeah, we've extended it to call rel equals episode, and we'll see whether people pick up on it.
Very fancy.
Now, one of the other clever people doing lots and lots of smart things around the podcasting index 2.0 is a guy called Stephen Bell. He is the founder and CEO of Curiocaster, but he also came up with Sovereign Feeds. He's got a lovely little project called the Music Side Project, and something that he's going to tell us more about called SplitKit. So I thought I'd reach out to him because he's a clever man and he's been working in this space for a little while. But we also did, James, you'll be glad to know, discuss cross-app comments and Nostr, and you'll be able to find out what we both thought of those two standards in this interview. Stephen is the CEO and founder of Curiocaster, a wonderful podcasting listening app, but he's also the inventor of Sovereign Feeds, which many of you may not know. Stephen, hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, Sam?
I'm great. Now, Sovereign Feeds, let's start off with that. What or who is Sovereign Feeds?
So Sovereign Feeds is a RSS feed generator that probably covers about 80% of the new Podcasting 2.0 tags that have come out with that new podcast namespace. I named it Sovereign Feeds because it's primarily aimed at people who want to self-host their own feeds. So if you got a WordPress site or you're using Linux or Linode or something like that, you can use that to generate the files and then upload that to your own server.
Okay, what made you write Sovereign Feeds? I mean, did you hear Adam talk about Podcasting 2.0 first? What came first, chicken or the egg, Sovereign Feeds or Podcasting 2.0?
So Podcasting 2.0 came first, and I was at work, and my job allows me to listen to a lot of podcasts, but there was no podcast player that did everything I wanted to do, so I started building my own, and then I had a friend tell me about No Agenda, so I was listening to that, and I heard Adam talking about this Podcasting 2.0 thing, and when I saw that they had the value for value and that the developers could get paid as part of the development, I was like, well, I'm going to start implementing that into this podcast player I'm building. So Curiocaster came first. And then Adam was always talking about how he needed some sort of feed generator that he could use so that he can start implementing the Podcasting 2.0 namespace, the new things that were coming out into his feeds, because he wanted all that stuff in his feeds so that he can start putting them there. And then the developers now had actual working RSS feeds to start testing these new tags.
So which tags did you start off with? Person tag, location, what was the first ones?
Oh man, I'm pretty sure I did everything that was up through, it was probably the fourth phase. And then when they did phase 5, I implemented that stuff pretty quickly. Actually, no, they're doing phase 5 now. So some of the stuff, if it's experimental, I'll put it in just so we can kind of iron out some of the wrinkles. But yeah, I think episode and season those are probably the two that I don't have in.
Okay. Now, Curiocaster, which is your podcasting app. First of all, curious to know why you called it Curiocaster.
I called it that because I always thought podcasts were... So I really like curio cabinets and just this collection of weird artifacts from around the world. And I thought, man, that's what podcasts are. They're just this collection of weird, like just everywhere. And you can get stuff from Bigfoot to listening to guys talking about podcasts to music. It's a collection of a whole bunch of stuff from around the world.
No, that makes it very logical. Now, with CurioCaster, is it an iOS app, a desktop app? Tell us more.
So it is a web app, and that's mainly because I don't know how to program in anything but JavaScript. But the other thing that's nice about the web apps is with the browsers making it easy enough to do progressive web apps, you can, on your phone, download it to your desktop, and it acts as if it was an App Store app. I also like the progressive web apps because now you don't have to worry about the app stores accepting your app. You can't get any more open than just downloading the app off of the internet.
No, I mean, look, you know that I've got my own app coming out shortly called Podland, and I've mirrored what you're doing in that progressive web app style for very much exactly the same reasons. Like, I didn't want to have 3 different development environments, web, iOS, and Android. And secondly, with the iOS 16.4 implementation support for PWAs, you've got push notifications and home screen iconography, etc., etc. So have you implemented any of the new iOS 16.4 features yet for CurioCaster yourself?
I have not, although I have found that aside from the way that iOS played music when your screen locked, that CurioCaster's worked on the iOS, but the number one complaint was that as soon as the screen locked, your podcast stopped playing.
Right. And has that been fixed, do you think?
I've got to be honest, I have not messed with CurioCaster lately because I've been so focused on the other one, Music Side Project, which is another app that I've been working on.
Well, as you mentioned it, let's talk about it. So what is the Music Side Project?
So Music Side Project comes from the idea that podcasters are having all the fun with being able to host their own content, and you can have that go out to the whole world, and any app can get on or can access your RSS feed, and then all the app is just the skin for how that RSS feed is displayed to the listener. So Alex Gate had come up with an idea called a podcast medium, where now your RSS feed has a tag inside of it that says, hey, this is just dedicated to music. And you could do it for video, you can do it for blogs or audiobook. So now instead of having a podcast app, you could have an audiobook app using the same RSS feed. But I'm excited about you doing it with the music. It reminds me of my younger days hanging out with the punk rock bands, and everybody was booking their own shows and printing their own t-shirts. And I was like, man, this is what RSS can be used to do, to allow musicians to now not have to use something like Spotify or get into iTunes, and they can go straight to their listeners. And with the value for value tag, that allows their listeners to support them directly instead of having to do the streaming or here's the 99 cents for the song. So It really reminds me of the punk rock days, and I don't know, I'm excited about it.
Okay, I'm curious why you started it as a side project. You mentioned the medium tag, and I fully agree. The RSS feed allows the RSS to tell the app what type of content it's going to display or should display. And so you could say within CurioCaster, for example, I get an RSS feed and it has the music tag set for medium, and therefore I change the wording from episode to track, and I change the show cover art to album art as an example, right?
Yes.
And you could have done that and created a filter. So why did you not embed it within your existing app? Why did you take it as a separate app?
So CurioCaster does have a music tab, and that was way back when people like Abel Kirby and Sir Spencer had made their own album, and then Dave Jones' son has an album. So this has been around for about a year. So CurioCaster was like, hey, like, we can put this in, but for me, music is a different experience than podcasting. So I don't have a problem with going into one app that is dedicated to just one thing, as opposed to this app that's an all-in-one app. So I also thought it would be nice for the bands to be able to just say, hey, go to this particular website, and now as a user, you're not having to filter between podcast or music. This is very focused on what it is.
Yeah, I can see the benefit of both, actually, a dedicated app and an all-in-one. Because as you said correctly, RSS is this amazing, flexible data format that allows us to transpose it into multiple digital content. Because again, video can be done through it, and audiobooks, as you mentioned as well. Radio, I think, is one that we're even talking about as coming through RSS now as well.
Yeah, especially with the live tag, you can do live radio shows, and man, like RSS is that all-in-one format that allows you to do just about any media distribution using this very common protocol.
Yeah, what I love about it as well, I think we're having a massive agreement here, Stephen, by the way, is that you've got that data portability, you've got data ownership. So it gives the owner of the content all of that control, which the closed wall gardens like Spotify and Apple just don't give you.
Yeah, and that's the exciting part is, man, any kid with a microphone can now get worldwide distribution, and who knows? I mean, that may be the next hit that the radio people, because it doesn't match whatever algorithm they have, would just bypass this person. And now this guy can still get his music out there, and word of mouth could spread this sleeper that no one was aware of, that now has an opportunity to spread his music or his message with the podcast. Or it kind of like with what Amazon's doing, where they allow people to self-publish their books. And so I believe the book The Martian was that sort of thing, where he self-published the book, and it was just word of mouth made it very popular. And now you can do that with just about any medium.
So how many musicians now have you got on the music side project, do you think?
So I've had 2 musicians. So I've got Music Side Project, which is the player, and then I've got the Music Side Project Studio, which is it's very similar to Sovereign Feeds, but Sovereign Feeds was aimed at podcasters. Studio has been stripped down where it doesn't have all of the tags that Sovereign Feeds does, so that a musician can just get their music up there. And I've got 2 musicians who have tried it out, and they host it on their own WordPress. And I had one talk to me, and he was excited about that because he said, man, I can put this on my own server, and I don't have to worry that if I'm in, say, Russia, and the United States says, hey, you're not allowed to pay these people in Russia, there's nothing that could be done about that. So he's excited that the stuff's on his own server. So
with value for value, do you think there is going to be an eureka moment where people get it? I mean, you and I get it. There's the community of early adopters within the podcast community that get it. But do you think we can cross the chasm, as the book says, into the mainstream and get people to understand it?
Yeah, if I didn't think that, I don't think I'd be spending my time on it. I think we are. Well, I posted on the Podcast Index a social graph that showed internet users throughout each year from 1990 through present. And in 1996, there were 39 million internet users, and in 1997, it was up to 50 million. Right now, there are 45 million unique Bitcoin addresses. That means that as far as internet usage goes, it's 1996. We're very early in the adoption of this, but once people get their first Satoshis, and it may be 1,000 Satoshis, which is 30 cents right now, there's something magical about that first boost you get that it all makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I've told this story many times. When I was at Netscape, we used to say the words like HTTP and www, and it's a URL, and this is the web, not the internet. And no, there isn't a search engine, so you have to do it this way. And people looked at you and went, what are you talking about? And I think we have that same challenge, which is new vocabulary. It's a digital wallet. That's an invoice. That's a Satoshi. And people are going, I don't understand what you mean. And I think, yes, and I violently agree again with you, Stephen, that I think people will suddenly penny drop or Satoshi drop, and then people will get it and they'll say, yeah, I understand it. And this is a better model, a peer-to-peer model of micropayments directly between listener and creator.
Yeah, and there's something that's very satisfying about giving your money straight to the person who is creating the media that you're enjoying. It's not a Netflix subscription where you've got this consumer producer model and then we're all just consuming from this mass conglomerate. It's, hey, this is a relationship between me and the band. And that's why when the podcasters read the boostograms out, it's exciting to hear, I sent this message in and it's being read out. And it's a call out and it's fun. And the same thing goes on with the live tag. And there may only be 30 people listening live, but there's just something fun that you can interact with the podcaster in real time. And yeah, I'm sending him a quarter with my message, but that quarter is totally worth the feeling I get back when he reads my thing out on the air.
Exactly. It just reminds me of being a kid again when your mum would write into the local radio station and say, it's my birthday. And then you'd be by the radio and they'd read it out and you'd be like, oh man, that's so exciting. So yeah, I get that feeling.
It's totally like that. And it feels good to give money to this person who is giving you value and entertainment. And I bet they're going to make a lot more doing it this way than they did through a subscription model or through buying a CD or through advertising. I think that we're at a point now that this technology is allowing us to build communities. And I think that's desperately what we want. We're so interconnected with how much the technology has connected us with the world, but I think we've lost that sense of community, and this technology is going to end up enabling us to have these digital communities.
Now, you've come up with another app, Stephen. I don't know when you get the time, but you've come up with another app called SplitKit. So tell me more about SplitKit.
Okay, so SplitKit was the idea. So Adam Curry had made a comment that 40% of his female listeners listen directly on the web page. They're not even using a web app, which means that they're missing the opportunity to boost his show. So I was trying to figure out a way that he can have a link on a show and then they click that and it takes them to a web page that allows them to boost the show with the boostergram. But then as I was building that, I was thinking it would be really cool for a band to have some sort of QR code that is behind them on a screen. And you could scan that while the band's playing. And then you can hit that boost button in the app that comes up and now send a message to the band. And now, have you seen the Instagram Live where they got a bunch of messages that are scrolling, or a YouTube live chat? And part of the fun of the YouTube live chat is reading the chats of the people who are watching live. And I thought, man, that'd be really cool at a concert where people are like, this is my favorite song. I kissed my girlfriend for the first time to this song. Or the artist can do something where, hey, everybody boost in what your favorite song is, and that's going to be the next one we play in the set. So now the audience can interact with the band. And I just thought that the SplitKit would be able to do something like that. Mm-hmm. And the idea behind the SplitKit is right now you can scan a QR code and send a payment, but it's only going to one address. What the SplitKit does is it allows you to put in several addresses, and because it's using Lightning's key send, now you can send one payment, and that payment will go to several addresses, and according to whatever the percentage you put in for that split, it automatically takes care of that. So now the drummer has his own wallet, the bassist has his own wallet, the sound guy has a wallet. So you can set up the whole production team, each has a wallet, and then they're each getting a percentage of every single boost that comes in.
And it's just coming off one, what looks like a QR code fundamentally, or is it a QR code?
So it's a QR code that just is a link to a website. And then that website is, they had set up a promotional page, and with that promotional page is tied all their splits and the percentages and everything. And then it's just got a big pink boost button that when you click that, you can decide, hey, I want to send 5,000 Satoshis. And then that will go to each of the wallets on the back end using Albi's API.
Nice. I like that. What else is coming down the track then from you?
Well, those 4 projects keep me pretty busy. My next thing that I want to do is for music side project, I want to start being able to share playlist. And then you have your own Albi address, because right now Music Side Project using Albi for everybody's wallets. So now you can tie your Albi address to your playlist. And if somebody likes what you've done, if they're like, man, this guy's really great at curating a playlist, now you can boost that curator. So I've got that. And then the other thing I'm trying to do is figure out how I can make embeddable buttons for the split kit. So instead of it just being a QR code, it could be a button that you copy and paste into your website. And then somebody can click that and it will route them to your promotional page.
Yeah, no, that's a really cool idea, because I remember in the very early days, a friend of mine built something like that. There was Twitter buttons and Facebook buttons that you could embed within websites. And when you clicked on it, it automatically brought up some JavaScript and fundamentally allowed you to tweet from a web page back to your tweet account and similarly to your Facebook account. And that they worked really well in the very early days. So I can see that working. And I love the idea of making it what is in effect a much simpler click. Here's a QR code and it does the job for you, rather than trying to understand how to do splits in the background, just hiding that complexity.
Yeah, I think that's the next stage we're in. I think we've got enough people who are excited about it that now we've got to figure out how to simplify it so that the next group of people can be excited about it, who aren't a bunch of tech nerds, but still are excited to be able to support the people. And once we get that, then it's on to the next stage, and who knows what it is after that. So if this is 96, the .com boom is about to come, where you just got a lot of money coming into it and a lot of ideas, and we'll see what sticks.
So going back, Stephen, to what you were talking about, playlists, did you see some of the stuff that Kevin Finn had recommended around pod rolls?
I have not. So the last thing I saw with pod rolls was it is just a list of GUIDs, and then you can do a lookup based on those GUIDs. And I saw what it looked like on the Podnews website, and it looks really slick. I think it's really cool. But so there's another one called Remote Item, and the idea is that you are connecting. So it looks like you would have the channel GUID and then the episode GUID, so that you could link to both of those and then just have, hey, I just need the enclosure URL for this particular episode. I mean, we just need a list of separate episodes and enclosure URLs that we can play in order, and just put that in the RSS space.
So my recommendation is that you've got rel equals channel for the pod roll, and you could have rel equals episode for the GUID list of playlists, right, of tracks.
Sure.
And so on Podfans, my own app, I've implemented it that way, so that you can go down to any episode, click add to playlist, and then name that playlist and aggregate it as one, and then share that out. So I think personally, that's a simpler way than the remote item tag, which I couldn't get my head around at all.
Yeah, so only thing I would like to see in either of those, because however we list it, as long as I can find the episode and the audio file I need, and then also find whatever images that go along with that, what's happening on the back end doesn't really matter. I can figure out. What I really want to make sure is that the curator is able to get his value block in there somehow. And right now there's a discussion on, okay, should the curator be included as a split or percentage, or should the curator be there and then the person who's listening can choose to, if he wants to, provide value to the curator. And I tend to lean towards, we don't put him in the podcaster split. The podcaster should have a say on who his funds are going to. But if a listener wants to support the curator independently, I think there should be some sort of mechanism for them to do that.
100% agree, because that curator is creating value for that podcaster by adding them to a playlist that people might then discover something of that podcast. So it might be multiple podcasters are being value added to by that curator of a playlist, and they should therefore give that curator some sort of value back.
Yeah, and I could see something also where inside the value block, we create some sort of dynamic tag. So right now it's a static address inside the value block. But if we had a dynamic address that said, hey, whoever the curator in this value block, this curated list is, go ahead and give them a 2% split or whatever the podcaster decides the split should be.
I agree. I think you're right, though. If we hard code it into the value block, that might cause a problem if that individual is not on the app concerned. There's ways of doing it, but yes, I think bottom line, the person who creates that playlist should have some value creator given to them in some way as a split.
Yeah, and that's what we're discussing right now, and we're pretty good at coming to something. And something else I really like about the Podcasting 2.0 community is we're a duocracy. We're not making decisions based on committee. It's, hey, if you build this, let your idea speak for itself. And whoever builds the most compelling thing will end up being the one whose idea ultimately triumphs.
Exactly.
And Fountain with their boostagram messages, that ended up, I know Adam Curry initially was just like, man, I'm not sure I like this. I don't want people being able to read my boost. And he's come around because the idea was compelling enough and Oscar was able to display, hey, this really does provide a lot of value for the listeners.
Yeah, and also I think strangely, look, I've tried to implement cross-app comments, and I know Daniel's put forward a new JSON proposal to replace the existing proposal of cross-app comments. But actually, the best way that I've found is because nearly everybody in the podcasting community supports the Lightning mechanism of KeySend, as you said, but also the Olby API. Mm-hmm. So you can really find the boostergrams across multiple apps in that way. And you can, through the API, suck those boostergrams in related to the actual episode. So it's quite an easy mechanism as a developer to bring in boostergrams from other apps into your app to show a fundamentally cross-app comment.
Yeah, so I wish ActivityPub was simpler to use. It just happens to be very complex, and I don't know that anybody's figured out how to make it so that you can post a comment within the app. Displaying the comments is one thing, but if you can't post the comments, then you don't really have a comment system. And yeah, the KeySend already is a mechanism that allows you to send a message to the podcaster. Now we just need a mechanism for the podcaster to share that message with any app that wants to access it.
Can I let you in on a secret?
Yeah.
Stephen, I'm not going to be using ActivityPub.
I understand. That's the main reason I have not implemented cross-app comments, because I found ActivityPub to be, it's a less than ideal situation, especially with the not being able to easily post a comment.
So I'm looking now at Nostr. Now, I know, again, talking of Adam was totally anti-Nostr, didn't like the word zaps, didn't think it was the way forward. And I think he's come around. And I think I fundamentally, probably about a month, maybe a little longer ago, had started getting my head into Nostr. Olby with the API now, I don't know if you're aware, now includes the Nostr npub within the API. So now you can pull that automatically. About 2 weeks ago, you couldn't do that. You had to let the user cut and paste it into your app. And now you can pull it through the API. And because of that, you can use that npub to post. You don't have to have the private key, because the user can have that within their own app. So when they click share, they can put their private key element in. So you're not breaking any identity of that individual. And I think personally, when you look at the fact that Nostr's using Olby, it's using the Lightning Network address, it's using fundamentally what we in the podcasting world use, right? The same sort of mechanisms for payments. Sure. It seems that there's a great synergy between those two platforms. I just fundamentally think the ActivityPub itself is a 10, 12-year-old technology who maybe his time has just been superseded or leapfrogged by Nostr.
Yeah, and I do like the idea with Nostr that you can use your one key to log into multiple different apps. And just like RSS, how I explained that RSS is the fundamental protocol going on behind the scenes, and every app you look at is just a skin to display what's in RSS. And Nostr seems the same way. You've got this stuff going on behind the scenes, and you can figure out what skin you prefer. So I really am excited about the idea of one key that is your identity. And I know that Nostr is still very new, so there's some aspects of it that it feels slow and with all the relays and everything, but we've been doing Keysyn and Lightning and stuff, and those guys are running with scissors as much as the Podcasting 2.0 guys are. And I think there's going to be opportunities for us to figure out how the technologies can work with each other.
Exactly. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. It's been a great pleasure to meet you. Remind everyone where they can find Curiocaster and all your other projects.
All right, so you got Curiocaster.com if you want a podcast player, sovereignfeeds.com if you want to self-host your own podcast. You've got Music Side Project if you want to listen to independent music artists. And then you've got the splitkit.com if you want to develop your own promotional pages and allow people to send you boost, or your audience to easily scan a QR code and send you boost.
And if they want to connect with you directly, are you on Mastodon or Twitter?
So I am Stephen B at podcastindex.social. That's going to be the primary way to get a hold of me. You could also get a hold of me at Music Side Proj, and that's my Twitter account. So I'm sure if you do a search for Music Side Project, you can find me. But I try to limit my exposure. I get overwhelmed with how many different social media things you can be on.
Yes, I think we all are. Stephen, thank you so much, and best of luck with all of those projects.
Yeah, you too. Good luck on Pod Fans, and appreciate the interview, Sam.
No worries. Thanks, Stephen.
Stephen Bell from Sovereign Feeds. And shall we jump straight into events and awards, Sam?
Mm-hmm. Go for it.
Yes, well, the Podcast Awards, the People's Choice Podcast Awards are here. Podcastawards.com is where to go to register for those. The voting for the web is closed yesterday, so we should find out the winners of that relatively quickly. There are some more awards happening in London on the 26th of April, which is, what's that, next week? It's next week. Yes, you can get there on the night if you like. You can also get there and watch virtually. Other events going on over the next couple of months include the New Zealand Podcast Summit in Auckland in May, on May the 13th, which I will be at. And then, of course, there's the Podcast Show 2023 in London between the 23rd and the 25th of May. Sam and I will be there. And Radio Days North America in Toronto on June the 8th and 9th, which I will be there for as well. And then, of course, there's Podnews Live, which we're looking forward to an awful lot. More details at podnews.net/live. There's events in Salford in Manchester on the 13th of June, and events in London on the 27th of September, which you should consider coming to. It'd be great to end up seeing you there. And there are more events, both paid for and free, at Podnews, virtual events or events in a place. And if you're organising something, tell the world about it. It's free to be listed. podnews.net/events. Now, what's been happening for you this week, Sam?
Well, Andy Lehman from Dads and Dudes and also the Podcast Answers was very kind to interview me about Podfans. So we had a good old chat about what we're doing with that. And I also spoke to Martin Lindeskog as well on the Tea Party Media about Podfans as well. So beginning to get a little bit more of the word out about what we're doing. It's not far. As I said, we've just added pod rolls and playlists. We're finishing off the onboarding. So we're hoping that we'll get the final alpha with everyone's feedback that we've had so far out the door at the end of this month, and the beta just before the London podcast show. So that's what we're working to.
Very nice.
James, what's been happening for you? You've been in America at the NAB, and you're now in Berlin.
Yes.
What else has been happening?
Yes, and it turns out that the German train system seems to be in some form of industrial action strife. This will be very you'll be very unused to this, being in the UK. Train drivers going on strike.
Yeah.
But it turns out that that's happening here as well. So quite how I'm going to get back to the airport on Friday. Well, I do know I'll be using an Uber, except I won't be using an Uber because I don't think that they've got Uber here, but they've got something vaguely similar.
Hang on. Wait. Germany, the country with the umlaut over the U, doesn't have Uber. That is just
not so far as I'm aware. I mean, frankly, Uber doesn't have the umlaut over the U, so what more can you say? But yes, there's all kinds of strikes and action going on here. I mean, I could be in Paris where everybody's trying to set themselves, on fire and everything else. Yes, it's a weird and wonderful thing. But yes, so who knows what's going to happen there? They do have Uber here, it turns out, so I'm not quite sure why I thought that they didn't have Uber, although it does look hideously expensive. So perhaps that's one of the reasons. But anyway, yes, so I'm here. So I've basically got a day off on Friday. So my idea was to travel around and see a little bit of Berlin. And turns out that traveling around is going to be hard. So I'll just be walking around instead. But, why not?
They've got a lovely zoo, James. Lovely zoo.
It does, yes, lovely zoo. Although that's a long walk away from me.
Yeah. Is the Bloob anywhere near
the what?
The Bloob, the indoor swimming area, is fantastic. It's a really nice one, actually.
Oh, great. Indoor swimming. Excellent. Well,
just thought I'd try to give you some places to go, James.
Thanks.
Look, you can go to Spandau Prison or the Olympic Stadium if you want, but I don't think you really want to do those.
Yeah, I think finding a pub would be nice, and finding some currywurst would be a plan. But anyway, we will see what happens. I have been invited to. There are some folk at Podigy who are having a party this evening, and they've invited me, and I've basically said, I've just flown for 24 hours. I don't think I'm going to be necessarily in the mood for a party, but we will see. But I am going to Spotify this evening, so we'll see whether or not they've got a party going on too. But anyway, that's it. Finally, for this week,
you can give us feedback using email to weekly@podnews.net or send us a boostergram. If your podcast app doesn't support boosts, then grab a new app from podnews.net/new podcast apps.
Yes, our music is from Studio Dragonfly. Our voiceover is Sheila D, and we're hosted and sponsored by Buzzsprout. Podcast hosting made easy.
Get updated every day. Subscribe to our newsletter at podnews.net. Tell your friends and grow the show.
And support us.
The Pod News Weekly Review will return next week. Keep listening.